Welcome to the Hello World podcast number 6. My name is Sean Wildermuth and I'm your host. The Hello World podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. I had a great time recording our next guest. Ward Bell is a Microsoft MVP and the VP of Technology at IdeaBlade, the makers of DevForce.net application development product, as well as Breeze.js for web development. Ward often obsesses on client technologies for business applications, data access, and development practices. You might know Ward better as the guy who wears the loud suits at conferences. Ward is always a good conversation, and I love running into him all across the country at different conferences because it's always a good conversation about data and data access. He really knows his stuff. Hope you enjoy this episode. Let me know. Now to Ward. Today, I'd like to welcome Ward Bell to the Hello World podcast. Hey, Ward.
Hello there, Sean.
How have you been doing this fine day? I know I've woken you up quite early to do this podcast.
Well, I did think that I was able to stay up that late in order to make your podcast this morning.
That's an approach that I usually get, fall into, but not this time. So, everybody knows you from your fancy level of dress out there at conferences and certainly pictures that have been floating on the web longer than you probably wanted them to. How did you get started in this business?
Well, I am an empty suit, but I will try and go into the Wayback Machine. There's always a danger in doing this of saying, "Hey, Grandpa, what was it like before electricity?" But I started as a kid, like everybody else, stumbling into a computer. Except in my case, it was an APL terminal on an IBM Selectric that was on the end of a long wire coming out of Armonk and arriving at my high school.
Nice.
And just kicking that around, but like most of us did, except that nobody really had the idea what a computer was in those days.
And was this an actual screen, or was this just...
No, there were no screens in those days. It was literally a typewriter and a modem and 16K of memory, and it was a IBM 360 running it in Armonk, and it was coming over the wire. It was actually, it was a project of an IBM fellow named Steve Dunwell. He had been one of the inventors of the Whirlwind computer that was checking for missiles arriving from Russia over the Arctic, something like that.
I'm sure the kids won't remember how important that was, but it's pretty crucial there for 40 years.
Yeah. Well, most of the kids today probably never spend any time under their desks, tucking cover under the desk like we did. So we were terrified in those days of the Soviet missile threat. Anyway, he had invented all kinds of things to make that computer happen, and so he became an IBM fellow. He, along with Ken Iverson and a bunch of others. And that meant essentially that you got to work on projects that interested you. And his passion was educational computing. And it turned out that my history teacher, his wife, Becky Willis, was passionate about this too and ran that program for him. And so she wired this into our school. And this sounds like, hey, that could happen today. But this was before there was any networking. There was no ARPANET. There was no nothing. And we had these computers. So anyway, cut ahead. And I'm a high school kid, can't quite afford college. I'm looking for a job. And Becky Willis talks to one of the other beneficiaries of her educational computing thing, which was a guy named Dr. Hageman. He was a neuroanatomist at Cornell Medical School in New York, and said, "You owe me a favor. Why don't you take a look at this kid?" And so I got interviewed there. And as a favor to her, not because I was any good at all, he hired me to work on his stuff, which was he was passionate about computer assisted instruction, natural language stuff. So it was kind of an AI lab at Cornell Medical School in New York. And that's where I cut my teeth, writing APL programs to try and understand what medical students were saying and guide them through courses.
Nice. And what is APL like? I haven't worked with it.
Well, it's one of those things you've just got to bring up on Wikipedia, if you will. It's a highly functional, highly dynamic language that has no types, and it had it was emerged from a sort of mathematical perspective on how you do programming, a functional perspective on how you do programming. So it was really functional, and he was the inventor of it. Was not big on using words, so it had tons of symbols, Greek symbols. And so you could write these incredibly long, and it hated loops. So you would write incredibly long, tiny programs with a string of symbols that could do amazing things. So
isn't that what F# does now?
No, F# is almost every language that you could mention. It has 10 to 20 times the size of the expression that would be rendered in APL. So there used to be competitions for doing one-liners in APL that would be like the whole game of life in one line. And so you would take a function, arbitrary function, and you'd go function / an array of something, and that meant apply this function over that array. And it had sums and inner products and outer products, and it was just because it had all this kind of tensor and array a multidimensional array manipulation built into it.
Yeah.
And one of the fascinating things about the history of it is that it was so facile and compact that it was actually one of the first languages to run on an IBM 360. It was so facile and so interesting to some people that Codd, who people may know invented the relational database, wrote his first version of his query language for a relational database in APL.
Wow. That's going back a while. And what and so in these days, when you were writing this APL, it was the same sort of students were coming in over terminal-less or screenless systems, or had this progressed far enough to where they were using green screens?
Yeah, we didn't have a screen for quite a while. I think we ended up, the 3270 sort of became popular, which is a green screen. Yeah. Sometime fairly early in my career, but it didn't start that way. It started out just banging away at 30 characters per second on a essentially electric typewriter with a cable attached to it, and it had a type ball. It would go rat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat on paper.
Wow.
This was definitely before personal computers. As a matter of fact, I remember going to Atlantic City for one of the first personal computer shows. And I thought it was a hoot that it was called Personal Computer, because it was like, are you kidding me? I mean, what's personal about a computer? Who wants these things? What is it? Personal? It's a computer. It's not personal. It's not impersonal. It's a computer. And who wants one of these anyway? This is never going anywhere.
Yeah. Who's going to take an entire room in their house for their computer?
Yeah. And then you quickly saw, like I saw the Sol computer, SOL, and it was made out of plywood and things like that. It was before the Apple II. God, I really am sounding like what's life before electricity. But anyway,
that's what a lot of these talks are about. We just finished with Jesse Liberty, and he was talking about foregoing punch cards for paper tape. So it's what people expect.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I did punch cards and paper tape, but this was my first encounter because this was way ahead of it all. And by the way, it was a time, what we call time sharing, what today we would call, like, I don't know what, interactive, or I don't know what you would call it today, but then it was time shared because you got a slice of a giant, super expensive machine.
Right. So better compile the first time, or better run the first time.
Actually, that was the great thing about APLs, because you had direct access to it and you were using it directly. Our development time was entirely iterative, right?
Oh,
because
wow.
it was effective. There was no compile. There is no compile. It's all interpreted. APL is interpreted. So we were able to produce code way faster than those guys who were carrying their cards up to the raised floor and bending on knee and handing it over to some operator who would run it through and then hand them back a box of paper of a core dump and say, hey, you figure out what went wrong. That was what was standard programming practice then with Fortran and PL1, which I also did. But we were so smug because we had this interactive thing. There was nobody standing between us and the 360, no human being standing us over us, and we just iterated because you'd type and it would go, and it was like a REPL today,
Sure.
And we were able to be so much faster and more productive than those poor bastards. And we're so full of ourselves. And of course, we didn't have any stinking types, and we didn't have any stinking compiler, and we didn't have any stinking box of core dumps. And we could create functions on the fly. One of the things you can do in APL is it can self-modify. So you can use APL to write another APL program, which you would then run and which you would then create another, be turned way down. So we thought we were, way out there. But run forward to today, right, where that's kind of what you do in JavaScript and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I can still hear people telling me that I would never understand what functional programming and living without types was, because those people had never. I think most of those people started with compile languages, right?
Yeah. These days,
when I see JavaScript, it's kind of like, oh, this takes me back, man, to think when things were everything was possible.
So let's. When you were in high school, were you doing programming on these systems, or did you, or you're really using them and playing with them, and so it wasn't until you got the first job that you started doing any sort of programming?
It wasn't. I was interested in history and political science and sociology. I didn't care a whit about computers. I was just goofy. It was just one of those things that I goofed around with, and it got me a job out of high school. I had long. And I needed a job because I couldn't afford to go to college. So I got thrown in at Cornell Medical School with a whole bunch of other really low-paid misfits. My colleagues were nobody had a CS degree that I remember.
Sure.
One of them was a taxi driver. Another one was she was I think she had stripped. I think she was a stripper. Another one was a PhD in Slavic languages. Which
has as much practicality as a cab driver.
We were just scooped up off the street, and if we could do it, we could do it. Like my mentor, there was nobody who knew any. We had no patterns or program. Nobody knew anything about how to do anything. We made it up. And one of my mentors there was this gay guy, and I didn't even know what gay was back then.
Sure.
And I bring it up simply because I don't think we're aware enough in our culture today of the rich variety of people who can be and are in the history of computing and who have done stuff.
Absolutely.
I learned from this guy just all kinds of things. I had no idea what was going on, and he was one of the first out guys I'd ever heard about. So it was we were quite a collection of characters.
So let's talk about that. So this first mentor, was it primarily something where he was trying to help you learn the language, or was he talking about, good technique? Or, I mean, when you say a mentor, other than, just the semantics of learning APL, what else did he give you that has really, paid off longer term once you stopped doing APL?
Oh, I'm afraid at that time we were not all that. I was a kid. Basically, it was really, no, there were no patterns. If there were patterns, then I'm sure there were. I'm sure there was some place to understand what you were doing. Mm-hmm. At some point, I think back on this stuff, and I think I should have been sued for malpractice. we didn't have any patterns. I mean, what they did is they emerged. We had patterns. They kind of emerged. And what this guy would do was show me the ropes about, not making really long programs and how to avoid loops. And, it was very, very focused on how to use APL effectively. We didn't have memory was a real premium in those days.
Sure.
So just to give you an idea of one of his discoveries, he realized that the numbers 1, 0, and 2 occur rather frequently, and they did for us. And the number 1 occupies 4 bytes, and the letters O-N-E occupy 3. Therefore, I could save a lot of memory by converting all ones in the number into the letters O-N-E.
That's funny.
That would be the kind of thing we would do. But you have to realize I had no idea what a computer was or a program was or how it went together. So he was my sort of technical mentor because he knew all these ins and outs. My real mentor was the guy who hired me. He was a great guy, Dr. Hageman, neuroanatomist. And his primary interest was in computing was as it related to education. And so he was trying to develop course material, and he wrote a lot of journal articles. And hey, kids out here, this is your chance to remember this really important point, which is the generosity of the people who bring us along. For example, he put me as a co-author on a paper he wrote in the 1970s. I didn't write a lick of it, but it helped. I was very proud to have my name on a paper.
Of course.
That was just the way he did it. He treated me like I was actually an intelligent human being and guided me along and gave me some hard lessons. And I can still see him because he had a neuroanatomy lab right next to our computer lab. And we would walk in there, and it was a gross anatomy lab, which means that there were cadavers everywhere. And I'm standing there trying to have a conversation about the program I'm writing as he's chain smoking over a dead body with its chest ripped open, and he's absentmindedly with bare hands tying tags around nerve bundles that I can't tell because it's all gray matter and the limbs are every which way. Now you kind of imagine you're trying to have a serious technical conversation with somebody who's elbows deep into the chest of a dead person, and that's that was the kind of thing it was. And he really guided me through the life of a programmer. Gave me chances, gave me opportunities, and I'll never forget them. And there's each of us now, as we move along, has an opportunity to be that person for somebody else on the way up.
Absolutely. And do you, at IdeaBlade, do you have a group of developers that you sort of mentor as well? You on the other side of that now?
I pretty much feel all the others. Other side of that across the board. And I do some of that. I think at IdeaBlade, I'd like to think that I'm doing more of that through my more public stuff, like when I get all dressed up in the funny clothes and talk to people at conferences or... I'm a
little confused. I assumed you dressed like that always, that you were just coming... you dress special?
Just for you guys. Yes, indeed.
I was not aware of that.
Did not know that. Well, I am in a fuzzy slippers at the moment, but
see, you can't get away from that.
I do think at this stage, I do more of that kind of thing, Sean. I think I spend more time trying to help people along, both with thinking about the software that they're writing and thinking about what they're doing with their lives, and trying to keep them open to new, other ideas, things that can come along, and also learning from them too. I mean, it's a great cycle. Nobody will learn anything from me unless I'm learning something from them. I've noticed that.
Yeah. In fact, I think that's so the sort of the nature of it, that people, I think, people get lost in the idea that they have to be the smartest guy in the room in this business. And forget that, it's a two-way conversation, whether you're, talking to someone at that you just heard speak at a conference, or whether you're talking with your coworkers. Everybody is, continually learning something. And it took me a long time in my career before I figured that out, that the people that I was getting good advice from were learning while we were talking as well.
Oh, that it is so important, and it is so important to making a real conversation. Again, I go back to this Dr. Hageman guy. I learned it from him. We all sort of joked about how he wasn't the best programmer, and we were always the best programmers. But of course, he had all the best ideas. He had the fundamental ideas about what we were exploring in artificial language stuff. I mean, natural language stuff, but we would have these conversations in which we got to be the authority as the kids or as the people who didn't know, and he was perfectly comfortable in that conversation of trading that back and forth, and that made him amazingly open, and we could actually learn to him because our own egos were somehow satisfied by the fact that we had our areas of expertise, he had his. It was fine. Nobody had to crush anybody else.
Right.
That is the kind of maturity that he had, and that I hope someday to have.
So it sounds like, you got this first job because you couldn't go to college. Did you ever get a degree?
I don't know how, but I did.
Oh, good.
But it was in sociology.
Because that's what you were interested in.
That was what I was interested in. I swear I would never have anything to do with computers. But again, I was a way to pay for college as I was at college. So I was one of the rare people who had, one of the very few who had a computer because I was working on, in order to fund this other research, we started doing stuff with in the finance industry. Oh. I think S&P Blue Book or something like that. That was one of my projects. And so I had an acoustic in my dorm room. I would have a telephone and an acoustic coupler doing 30 characters per second. That was the speed at which it ran, and a portable Selectric with a type sphere on it. And I would, throw that out my window on my first floor dorm and sit out in the sun and program out there. and I was making money. And so I could make money doing the computer stuff, and then I would concentrate on sociology.
Interesting. And did the lack of a computer science degree, since you ended up in this business, right? You didn't become a sociologist or whatever people with sociology degree do. I think they drive cabs and.
No, that was where the big money was, but I decided that I wasn't going to take the big money in sociology. I was going to go into computers. I never took a CS course in my life. I sat on a Michael Stonebreaker database course at Cal, because I went to Cal for graduate school in sociology. Mm-hmm. Do I think it ever... So I don't really know how my life would have been different if I had actually ever studied it. I confess that as a result of not having had that experience, I'm disdainful of it, because that's what we do, right?
Yeah.
Anybody, immediately suspicious of anybody who tells me about their CS degree. I say, yeah, really? Because none of the people I ever knew when I was coming up had CS degrees.
Right.
But I have to concede that it's probably possible to learn something while you're getting a computer science degree, and that stuff might even be useful to you. But I don't lionize the computer science degree, and it's never stood in my way. Nobody ever, in those days, nobody asked me whether I had one, and they didn't expect it, they didn't demand it, nobody looked for it. Now at this point, I don't think anybody cares.
No, they just want to see you dress up. Yeah. So, what led to you leaving that position and moving into, into something else? Was it just that you were going to grad school on the other coast, or?
Yeah, that was a driver. Also, as I was doing less and less artificial intelligence work, and more finance industry work that was effectively funding the research that other people were doing.
Sure.
And this was in part because, hey, I was going off to school, right? I couldn't, I was a part-timer at that stage. So now the lure of money became even more powerful. And so I had pretty much ended up doing consulting on my own with in the finance industry, places like Morgan and American Express and Merrill Lynch and things like that. And I stopped doing the AI things.
Interesting.
And then when I came to the West Coast, eventually, I guess I got a job, a consulting job with the GE company out here in San Francisco, and then at some point, again, you get another mentor, somebody who comes along, changes your life.
Yep.
And he would say, he was a very gruff guy. Boyo, he'd call me Boyo. Boyo, you got to get out of that computer stuff. You got to come over here and work with me. And so I thought, hey, instead of being the guy who was told what the requirements were, I would jump the fence and become a manager in an operational department and tell the computer, where they had their systems were in total chaos. And so by jumping over there and being on the business side, I would tell my former pals on the IT side what their programs would be, and they couldn't bullshit me anymore. Right. That was one reason he hired me, was because he knew I could do this other stuff, but I couldn't be bullshit. But all by the IT guys who would tell me that the software had to be this way or that, or it was too hard to do, or any of that stuff.
Yeah.
And that made me valuable to him as he was trying to tame the chaos in certain operational area. And for me, the traction was that I could put down stop programming for a while and start seeing what it was like to be the business person who needed other people to write programs for me. And that was a fascinating number of years.
And did you enjoy that, being on that side of it? Did you feel like you were getting away from the technical stuff too much, or was that just not a problem?
That was not a problem. Also, once you've learned this kind of stuff, the hard part was to stop writing code. Right. And I never really quite mastered that. I just found myself saying, because I would ask for some software and they would deliver it or late and it wouldn't be very good. And I'd say, screw this. And I'd end up writing some of it myself and saying, here, take that and go make that better. So I never, I didn't really feel like I lost it that much. Where I was losing it and didn't know it is that I was still in the world of Big Iron and APL. Sure. And all these other things that were going on with personal computers that I knew nothing about. And eventually there was the net, things we're doing, somewhere in there, it's all a blur. Sure. But somewhere I left that, and then I went for a startup during the 90s, and that was where I re-engaged with where the internet was. I also omitted a really fascinating episode, which was as a graduate student, I was trying to come up with my dissertation, and it was going to be on, there was a popular left thinking, something called de-skilling, which was the world is becoming de-skilled. Right. And I was doing this stuff in computers, and it just didn't feel that way to me. It felt like every time, yes, we would try and write software that would reduce the level of skill, but that just seemed to create a new round of new kinds of skills that were needed. So I was going to try and poke at that thesis of whether it was really going on. And so I decided to start studying the way in which software was made as a sociologist. Interesting. And one of my case studies was a place called Community Memory. You can look it up. these were a bunch of, folks, visionary types in Berkeley who thought it would be really socially important if everyday people could walk up to a computer and share their experiences with each other. And so they built these boxes out of plywood with these early computers and personal computers in them, and put them in laundromats, and people would roll up and type things in them, and it would store them, and it would share them with, other people could find what they said. And it was just, someday people might actually share their personal lives with each other via computer. That was,
or overshare them. Yes.
Yeah. And it would change the world. Well, and of course, privacy, the hell with that. What we were fascinated by was all the things that they would put in. So we would sift through everything that they put in the system, looking for those gems of wisdom and the potential for revolution that was in those logs. And basically it was mostly crap, right? I mean, that's right.
Of course. I like my Reuben sandwich. Yeah,
exactly. There were moments of poetry in there, but not many. But that was the vision. We would harness the power of the computer in the service of the community, man. But we had to fund it. So they did all the, again, in order to do these things, you would have these commercial things. And I was watching them and trying to help as they would, they provided one model of how people built software. And then I would contrast that to what I was doing as a consultant back in New York, working for the
financial firms,
for whomever, Merrill or somebody. So I was studying these two things, but that community memory movement was an interesting one. It was full of vision about a better world through computing.
It's interesting because you had mentioned that notion of descaling and all of that, and it reminded me of there's this fairly famous article that people, if I can find it on the web, I'll link it in the show notes. But it was called The Paperless Office. That computers were going to make it so that we could talk and do all our interactions. We didn't have to shuffle paper and file them anymore. And then the first laser printers came out, and there suddenly was a paper shortage in the world because we were now able to produce, anything we needed much easier than typing it or any of that other sort of thing. So the revolution of computers caused more paper to be printed than had ever been printed before, just because you could do it in these mass quantities. Oh, I can write a 15-page paper in 24 type and then print copies for everybody in the office. Why would I possibly send that in an email or in some sort of computer message?
I do remember that. The laser printer it was just an explosion. Oh. We all had our own ability to print for ourselves.
Everyone talks about how HP made a killing on the laser printer, which they've done pretty well for themselves, honestly. But Georgia paper mills made more money than anybody. It's crazy how much the paper companies and the raping of Oregon and Maine to satisfy our ability to write, to make a birthday sign in the office
or a ransom note or whatever it was.
Yeah,
we killed a lot of trees that way. And then suddenly it was all the blog, right? It was all going to be about the blog. Now who knows where it's going?
Now the blog's too long.
Yeah, it is really. Just give it to me in 140 characters, please.
Yeah. All right. Who knows where it's going to be? Snapchat. I'm going to share some stuff with you, but only for 10 seconds.
But as it relates to what's happened to the whole descaling question in terms of what it means more broadly for the skills of people in the economy, it's really hard to say how that's played out. I mean, for those of us who write software, that thesis doesn't make much sense because we keep saying, holy moly, everything I learned last year is useless to me because I have to learn all this new complicated stuff for next year. And so it never seems like you're headed in a world of drudgery and skill removal. It just seems like you're overwhelmed. And I think that there are counterforces, but whether for the economy as a whole, if you looked across America and said what are the necessary skills and how are those distributed over the entire population, I don't know how that thesis plays out. It's not clear that that for the vast majority of the workforce, whether their skill level, whatever that means, has gone up or whether it's gone down.
Yeah,
don't know.
It's or just changed.
Or
just the kind of skills that they're used to. They used to go to a 2 or 4 year college to learn how to do word processing, and now it's assumed that everybody can do word processing. It's one of those things that I think innately we think of these things as, we used to think of them as as trained skills, and now we're sort of expected to be able to do many things. The idea that that someone is computer phobic is frightening, especially to us in this business, right?
Right.
We all have that uncle who's like, no, I'll just call you. Don't text me.
Yeah.
And what I find interesting in the whole, sort of sense, and you had mentioned, we feel like we need to relearn everything every couple of years, and the things are changing so fast. I'm actually on the other side of that fence. I would like to believe that developers start to figure out the pattern after they've been in the business a couple of years, and that is that what you're learning is applicable to whatever will be there in a couple of years. The work you did in APL, if you needed to drop in and do a Sharp project, there are things you learned from that the syntax may be different in F Sharp, but it's essentially the same idea. Anyone that learned Apple Basic as a kid will understand what a for and an if is in VB or C# or JavaScript. We're building on those same components. Maybe some of the syntax changes and maybe how we mark up the UI changes, but our job as developers, I really believe this is continuous learning. Is finding the better way to do this stuff.
I agree. I mean, it's a mix, right? I mean, I'm at one level, and it's one of those things that when you've been around, you're afraid because you do it all the time. Is you say, "Hey, I saw that back in 1973," or that's not new. That was invented back then. And to some degree, it's true. And some of the things like everybody getting all gushing all over NoSQL, and I'm thinking to myself, man, I lived in the era before there were SQL databases. And the SQL database was struggling for air, and so I know what that was like and what problems one of them solved and what problems it didn't, and so that kind of has to be rediscovered over and over again. And I can say that from my lofty perch of old age, but at the same time, I'm really, I think those things help us. That's what we were talking before this podcast started about, bringing some of the patterns we had learned in desktop applications towards the building of single page applications. And anybody who just came from the web world would have none of that experience to draw upon in trying to build a client-side HTML JavaScript application. So, we're busily harvesting this knowledge and experience that we've had elsewhere, but there is something new about it in the way those old ideas meet the new conditions, and that is always kind of stunning. Like the idea that we would all have our own computer, our own devices, or 10 or 12 of them. Yeah, I mean, that was just inconceivable when I was coming up, and that really does change things. Even if I'm bringing forward some of the things that functional programming, that was remember when I started, like, I didn't know there was anything other than functional programming.
Sure.
All right. So now when I meet people who are discovering functional programming for the first time and they say, Ward, you'll never learn this stuff because you learned. And I say, what are you talking about? That's where I started. but it really, it both is the same and it's so much different now. And we're so much more conscious of patterns and how things work than we were when I was coming up. That it's the old is new again, but it's not it isn't just the old repeated, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Well, no, I don't suggest that. Things are changing, but we're building on our set of knowledge. We're not reinventing it every 2 years like I think some people think we are. We're taking everything we know, and we may be building them in different ways with different technologies, but we're not throwing out what we knew. It's really helping our experience. One of the I'm trying to think of how many years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I got to meet at one of the conferences the guy who wrote the MVC paper in 1971.
Yeah.
And so that was one of those moments where I'm like, this is the deal. MVC wasn't important for 5 or 10 really until Smalltalk came along, because it just wasn't, you weren't able to really do it easily.
Right.
And now we have enough bandwidth that we can do, MV star, whatever it is, MVC, MVP, MVVM, whatever you want to call it. Because we have these extra cycles laying around that we can now consume, even on these handheld computers that we happen to make phone calls on.
That's right. But did you go back and look at that paper? It must have been 1972, 73, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
The way there's a freshness to the encounter with MVC, because as if it were just being discovered, because it was just being discovered.
In fact,
that is that you get sort of this acquaintance with the problem as they saw it. I think that is incredibly refreshing, and I think that the database people should go back and would really enjoy and learn from going back and seeing what the people who were discovering, who were just sort of inventing the relational database, what problems they thought they were solving, because it gives you, and why they thought it would be better than what was the NoSQL databases of the time. And because that freshness is really can invigorate our thinking about these problems now that we have faster everything and bigger everything.
And I think it's also the case where people find the new, especially in our business, they find the new and they think, oh, this is applicable everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, that certainly happened with the NoSQL. Oh, well, we're just going to get rid of all SQL databases because NoSQL will solve it everywhere. I designed a system back in the late internet bubble, the first bubble, that we used both because we had this great need for something like a NoSQL database, which was an LDAP store, which was another one of those NoSQL things that have been around for a long time. And then we use SQL when we needed to get all this, when we need to get the bulk of data that we need to be able to query in really, really rich ways. And people starting to understand where this stuff came from, I think, can give them those clues to, not everything's a hammer. Right.
That is so true. And everybody says not everything's a hammer, but if you really live with it, if you go and see when there was a real debate about some of these things before they were givens, before they were everybody's position was hardened, you get that can really open your eyes about how not everything is a hammer and not everything's a nail. So I'm with you on that.
Yes, if you go back to before there were hammers,
yeah, exactly.
You understand why
it was invented.
Yeah.
And everybody else was using a screwdriver, and they said, "Hey, look, we got this thing called a hammer." And the guys with the screwdriver says, "Yeah, but you can't use it for over here because that's what." And the hammer says, "Yeah, but you can't do it over here where I've got nails." And when you see that tension being played out, and you see how they were trying to figure out what the different characteristics of the problem they were trying to solve, how they lended themselves to one thing or the other, it's that really is eye-opening as you confront these technologies now.
I totally agree. Well, we've been talking way longer than we should have, but putting you and I together, the production of hot air can go up, certainly. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. I think hopefully the listeners will get a lot out of this, and maybe go back and look at some APL stuff.
Well, maybe they'll look at that. But my favorite message to everyone is to remember that you are going to be the mentor to somebody else, and to treat software development as the community and personal experience that it should be, and not simply as a technical experience.
I think that's great advice. Well, thanks again, Ward, and we'll see you next time on the Hello World podcast.
You betcha. Thanks a lot, Sean.